So, and now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And Matt, I'm not going to give your full bio, but I do want to make sure I let the audience know that Dr. Matt Langholtz is a natural resource economist in the bioenergy group at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. And he's also, is you can see on the whiteboard behind his head, one of the lead authors of the Billion Ton Report, particularly the BT23, that many of us are using as we frame our own work around biomass supply and demand. He's the principal investigator of the Resource Analysis Project at Oak Ridge, and we're going to, I think, hear a little bit more about that. And his research interests include biomass resource economics, short rotation woody crops, and bioenergy from forest resources. He's got a PhD in forest economics from the University of Florida and has done agroforestry extension in Latin America, among other places. And done work for the Department of Energy and the USDA in the feedstock supply development arena. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Matt Langholtz.
Thank you. Grateful for the opportunity to connect here. Emily, you asked me to give an overview of federal targets. I'll give a kind of high-level federal targets. Take this opportunity. Damon Hartley, I think, is coming on. He might touch base on the biomass resource hubs real fast. And I'll give the plug for our follow-up work on getting farmer feedback on barriers and opportunities to energy crop adoption. Emily, you had this kind of template. Do you want to say anything here?
Yeah, thanks for that. This will be in every time. I just want to remind of people if they want to share the registration information for this meeting. I mean, obviously everybody here has already got it, but we have the QR code and the link there should you need it. And this work is sponsored by the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as funding from a generous donation to the University of Illinois for our regenerative ag initiative called iRegen. Right. And it's done in partnership with the University of Illinois and Iowa State University. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Okay, so this title yesterday said demands for decarbonization. I changed it to demands for bioproducts. Raises some questions about their always kind of shifting interests. And we could talk about if the interests are for decarbonization or renewable energy or a combination of the two. But maybe this is the latest kind of greatest examples of federal targets for the bioeconomy. And basically, we would focus on these, for example, these hard to electrify transportation sectors as some key examples, right? We could be talking about biopower. We could be talking about biomass for carbon removal and storage. But just to look at kind of the latest key examples of federal targets, basically looking at this aviation sector targeting 35 billion gallons per year of aviation fuel by 2050. So the SAF Grand Challenge roadmap that came out, I think, in 2022. The target is 3 billion gallons per year by 2030 and 35 billion gallons on the scale here per year by 2050. So rough estimate, I'll hit a couple times here going later, next slides, but if we wanted to displace all of our aviation, there's 35 billion gallons per year with cellulosic biofuels that would require about 0.6 or 0.65 billion tons of biomass per year. And if we wanted to displace all of these hard to electrify sectors, marine, aviation, rail, and off-road, that would require about 70 billion gallons per year, which would take about 1.3 billion tons of biomass per year. So By the way, there's this Clean Fuels and Products Earthshot, and that targets 100% aviation, the SAF Grand Challenge, like you see here, plus 50% of each of these other things. So that would be somewhere between 0.6 and 1.3 billion tons of biomass per year. That's kind of a high level of federal targets. How do we think about producing about 1 billion tons of biomass per year? We look to these national biomass resource assessments supported by Department of Energy, Bioenergy Technologies Office. Could go into about, how each of these are building on each other. Basically, back in 05, starting with supply and then building on economics, environmental sustainability effects. In the latest report, a lot like the last one, adding some resources, but with, I'm going to say this is kind of addressing some communication challenges with the last report. So for example, basically we have modeling projections in the report, but those get misinterpreted as forecasts in the report. So we can't predict market trajectory. So we can't predict energy crop, for example, response to market. So the report is not a forecast. It's also not a target. We don't try to find 1 billion tons and then find 1 billion tons. It's just an assessment of production capacity. The report's policy agnostic and end use agnostic. 54 contributors from 11 organizations, 30 reviewers from 17 organizations. Big multidisciplinary effort. So big multidisciplinary team. Can summarize. So I'll get to I'll try to fast forward here to get to our energy crop interest. But just to say in the report, we have resources that we currently use, resources we currently have, and resources that we could use or have more of in the future, more forward-looking. But starting with the resources that we currently use, largely corn ethanol, largely corn to ethanol, waste wood to power, right? About 340 million tons of biomass per year. Waste wood, corn to ethanol combined producing about 5% of US energy production. It's our largest single source of renewable energy, biomass energy. So this 400 million tons kind of is the starting point of the BT 2023 billion ton report and the foundation of the future 2023 billion ton report scenarios. Starting with the near-term scenario, those resources that we currently have, waste, largely logging residues and ag residues like stover. And then for this group here, we have these mature market scenarios where we add our energy crop production capacity, and the largest portion of that being herbaceous energy crops like y'all are focused on, Miscanthus and switchgrass. We'll get to a tree map. And upshot's going to be herbaceous energy crops are the largest single source of production capacity nationally as we see it. I don't mean to be too crystal bally about this. Obviously, there's a lot of sources of uncertainty in each of these. But overall, you can see some things go up, some things go down, but overall production capacity of about 1.2 million tons per year of biomass in a medium scenario. In an emerging scenario, we had other things like microalgae and macroalgae, a lot more expensive. What can 1 billion tons provide? Whether it's 1 billion tons with currently used or a whole new 1 billion tons on top of our currently used at 55 gallons a ton, kind of a typical conversion rate, 55 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent per year. That's a lot more than we currently produce in biofuels. It's a lot more than the SAF Grand Challenge. It's more than both of these combined. It's still a lot less than total transportation demand. So 1 billion tons can go a long way for a significant contribution overall. And the SAF Grand Challenge, that 0.6 billion tons, 640 million tons per year to meet the SAF Grand Challenge. I'm not here to say where that 600 million tons would come from, but it could be satisfied from a variety of these sources, probably a lot from things like Miscanthus. And if you were to provide 70 billion gallons for all those marine, off-road, aviation, and rail, then this is maybe a higher bound on biofuels demand that we could see. Okay, so looking at this kind of mature market medium scenario real fast, and okay, Emily, I had like 20 minutes, right? And I probably burned through most of that. Okay, I'll try to speed up here.
No, I started a little late, Matt. Don't worry. We'll tell you if you're running out of time.
Okay, I'll try to cut to the chase here a little bit, but just to say, if this is, so ag being the largest single source of biomass, and those perennial herbaceous crops, this guy here, like 345 million tons per year of things like miscanthus and switchgrass in terms of production capacity. Just to mention real fast, when we say 180 million tons of things like corn stover, that's not all of our corn stover. We have environmental sustainability constraints and economic constraints, which means we only pick up about a third of the total of the ag residues. Energy crops. How do we approach this? One approach is to assume a central planning, highly regulated, we're going to filter for marginal lands and we're going to tell farmers where to go crops. Our approach is to use a partial equilibrium economic model that simulates farmers' decisions and basically competes crops with each other. And then we assess the impacts on conventional crops like corn, soy, and wheat. We acknowledge, yes, it's possible that miscanthus and switchgrass and things like that could eat into conventional crop lands, but those crops would converge where they have higher yields, mitigating impacts on production. There could be small impacts on crop prices, which could be great for farmers. And food prices as a subset of crop prices could be non-zero.
Hey, Matt, does this axis, so the y-axis is percent relative to business as usual, and then the colors refer to the mature market under low, medium, and high energy crop prices?
Low, medium, and high, that's a great question. Energy crop scenarios, which could be unpacked a little bit more here given time, but what's key there. So these mature market, low, medium, and high energy crops ag scenarios, the variable here is not demand or price, it's yield. Right? So if yields improve, yields improve for miscanthus like they've improved for corn, then you get the most miscanthus in that scenario and the lowest like corn, soy, wheat price impacts, right? Because yields everywhere are good. Basically, there's enough production to satisfy all demands. So that's where that's coming from, Emily, that low, medium, and high energy crop scenarios based on yield.
Got it. Thanks.
So if we can realize high yields, it's all upside, basically, right? Most biomass, least downside. Looking at this mature market medium price impacts, by the way, I'm going a little bit too deep, but maybe just to put out there that we're looking at this sort of thing. Yes, there are commodity price impacts in our modeling results, but they're well within recent historic variability of those crop price impacts. In other words, could you have food versus fuel? Well, yes. But we also have programs to avoid overproduction. We also have issues of low prices that farmers struggle to deal with. So there are trade-offs to consider. So it kind of depends on how much time we have to talk about this when someone asks about food versus fuel, right? So yes, trade-offs, and the upside of that trade-off is, so when we look at that mature market medium scenario between the better prices for farmers, their ag residues that they can sell, and the energy crops that they can sell, farmers can make another $20 billion a year. And if you look at economic multiplier effects, you can get another 500,000 jobs compared to the business as usual scenario, and another $100 billion a year compared to the business as usual scenario. So we're not here to say there are no trade-offs, but obviously there are some economic trade-offs and a lot of upside. And I think we're here to say more upside than downside. Damon, are you on by chance? I don't know if Damon is able to make it on.
Yep, I am on.
All right. You want to talk to this real fast?
Yeah, so part of realizing that energy crop potential is having developed the energy crops going into the future, right? These are things that while there's work going on and it happened, it's not widespread yet. And so we're looking at how we can improve the mobilization and production and mobilization of dedicated energy crops. And so we have, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Regional Biomass Resource Hub Initiative, which is led from the Department of Energy, but is being led by the Idaho National Lab, which is where I'm from. And we're managing the project. There have been 6 projects selected. And what we're trying to do is take the information from these 6 research projects on various dedicated energy crops and look at how we identify and validate market-driven regional strategies to mobilize purpose-grown energy sources. And what we're really trying to do is facilitate project management, facilitate network coordination amongst the hubs, and provide the data so that it's accessible to all of those who are interested. And that's including internal, because part of this is we have research ongoing as well that combines some of what Matt was talking about potential and looking at understanding how market forces play into mobilization. I think Matt's going to kind of continue on to that path right now. So,
Want to speak to this one?
Sure. This is just kind of a pictorial thing. It's kind of complicated, but really the intent is to show from the hubs that it really ties all these entities together, is what we're trying to do. So we have the national labs that are going to have certain projects on, like ours is on mobilization of the resource. Other ones that I know of at INL are looking at processing and how do you get it into products. We're going to have regional hub leads. If you haven't seen that and you're interested in maybe being a hub lead, let me know and I will send you the link that you can apply to that. But what our hub lead is looking for are what are the regionally specific opportunities, and how do we tie producers and consumers together within a region? How do they access the research that's happening at both national labs and USDA? We have the FOA crop teams that I just mentioned were selected. And then we have historic work that's happened across both DOE and USDA. We're trying to get all of that together to get a critical mass to make biofuels go, or at least have the supply there that when an industry comes in, that risk is checked off, that have enough supply on the ground that we can reasonably start an industry. So.
Right. Congratulations, Emily, for being selected for one of these resource hubs. Okay. So just planting the seeds for some follow-up. Damon and I have this DOE-funded project mobilizing billion-ton resources under uncertainty, and that's what Damon was talking about. What are barriers to adoption? We want to understand farmers' perceptions of what are some barriers to adoption and opportunities to overcome those. And so we're not going to get into that now, but maybe for future planning in about a month or so. If you hear about that, then that's what we're talking about. Our project is to understand from this group barriers to adoption of energy crops.
So I'm just going to be explicit right there, Matt. So there's a lot of people on this call who've grown these crops or evaluating their likelihood to improve your bottom line or your other decision-making characteristics of your operation. And so I think what you've heard from Matt and Damon so far is they're responsible for helping to advise the industry and frankly the government on how they should be thinking about biomass crop availability. So if we reach out to you and say, would you be willing to talk to us about how you think about price or profit or risk or agronomy, any of the things that are on your mind as you consider your own energy crop operation, that's how this information will be used, is to advise the government and to provide information to the investment community.
So that's all I have. I'll put a few links in the chat about a report data portal, and a landing page and videos and stuff like that. But happy to talk about this.
Thanks, Matt. I'll give it just a second in case people want to take a picture of that QR code. One question I had right off the bat, Matt, is first of all, thank you. I got to do my little applause thing, but thank you very much for giving us this presentation, you and Damon. Could you comment about the billion-ton report and the SAF Grand Challenge in context of other uses for biomass? You have a very specific focus on types of energy. Could you comment on, your perceptions of the market opportunities outside energy or beyond the scope of the energy source or energy conversions that you looked at?
So do you mean like bioenergy versus wind and solar, or do you mean like biomass resources versus existing markets for biomass? Or
I think there's people on the call who'd be interested in both of those perspectives. Maybe just to kick it off, could you, just maybe a quick commentary on how you see the renewables portfolio and biomass in comparison to wind and solar in particular, or
probably
nuclear and coal, baseload
yeah.
energy.
Yeah. So it's beyond my expertise, maybe just about a few like things that kicking around in my head. So all this interest in EVs and wind and solar, and it's often said that wind and solar are price competitive with coal right now, but really not when you account for energy storage. And I think bioenergy can play a key role in the overall portfolio of renewable energy sources in terms of storage. And I guess the key example of that is for SAF. Like, why are we targeting those hard to electrify aviation and other sectors? Because EVs can't fix that problem. Maybe real fast, by the way, like if the goal is decarbonization, direct air capture that people are looking at is probably about $800 a ton CO2 abated, and biomass has so many ways to come in much cheaper than that. If there's a market for carbon abatement, biomass, whether it's displacing fossil or biomass for carbon renewable storage, has many economic advantages. I think overall, You know, we talk about renewables and you never hear about biomass, but still, I think folks in the know that biomass has a key role in an energy transition. So I think that's where EERE is. Interested to hear what other folks are thinking about that.
Thanks, Matt. And you can stop sharing now if you want to help see all the faces.
Sure.
Steve, did you have a question?
You talking
Maybe
about
just cleared your throat.
Steve Schomburg?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's more of a comment. I don't know. But once again, in the report, I heard this discussion about land quality as if the whole foundation of this is based upon finding less productive acres to put into Miscanthus. And as a grower, I think we've found that Miscanthus likes corn ground. It likes to grow on good ground. It doesn't like weak soils. So I just question some of I don't know where the assumptions are that there's that many acres out there that can be found. That's all. I'm enough on me.
That's a great comment. That's a great comment. I totally agree. I totally agree. Like, if there's unproductive land and it's marginal land, which then it's marginal for a reason, and we can't assume that energy crops grow great there. But rather, what we can consider is where lower input cellulosic crops can have a comparative advantage. They might have lower yields on lower yielding land, but they might have comparative advantage on lower yielding land. So there's certainly trade-offs. And that's why we quantify those potential impacts on our conventional crops. Right? We're not here to say there will be no impacts on corn, soy, and wheat. There are some trade-offs to consider.
Thanks for that comment, Steve. And certainly we've seen, there's a lot of crops in this portfolio, and thinking about where switchgrass complements Miscanthus or some of the oil seeds is also, relevant to that land configuration. Other questions or comments for Matt?
So, Matt, thank you for the presentation. I want to keep going on Steve's line of question, really. I don't understand exactly the assumptions that underpin a lot of the reporting you do. So I might be off here, but if you allow for a little bit more inclusive areas of opportunity for biomass production, do you think there are scenarios where you'll go above the target you set? So if you're, for example, growing some on some of that corn ground that Steve talked about, or do you think that already includes quite a bit of that, and it's not going to go over the target you've talked about? That's
a great question. Yeah. So the way we came up with that 400 million tons or so of energy crops of different types is, and I'll try not to get too deep here, but for every county, for every crop, we have yield and a cost of production. Then for a business as usual scenario, we project meeting the USDA baseline projection. And so we solve for production and prices for corn, soy, wheat, etc. Then what we do, what I showed was where we introduce a market for biomass at $70 a ton. So in that result, you see the production shown, and I don't know if I showed like the maps of all the production, but kind of that medium, to get to your question, I think that was the simulation at $70 per ton of biomass. And if you increase the price, you get more biomass, more incursion into conventional crops. So that's the trade-off. So could prices go higher? They could. But right now, does industry want to pay more for cellulosic biomass? Probably not. So that $70 is an arbitrary price, the price point where maybe farmers can start producing and biorefineries can start buying. But if you pay more or less, then you get more or less with different impacts.
Great. And I guess my last question on that line of reasoning is, in future reports, are there going to be scenarios where the price exceeds that, or maybe even there's some payments for ecosystem services that fold into the price? As a scenario, right?
Yeah. So we have so we have various prices up to $120 and $10 increments offered. So we kind of have those, we have higher price points that we can share. It's just for a summary, we show the 70. The payment for ecosystem services is really interesting. And the report's policy agnostic, so we haven't done that, but it's worth doing, in my opinion. I think it's a great idea. Now that would involve sub-county input, probably. So what we're talking about with folks like Rob Mitchell and Marty Schmurr is, how do you take a county and break down how much of that land, or how much of a county might be appropriate for payment for ecosystem services if you switch an annual to a perennial? Could there be a price premium for that? How would that influence production? Things like that, right? So
it's an interesting coincidence, Matt, that you said 26 million acres in the scenarios that you showed for energy crops. And if you look at sort of all the ag land in the corn belt, that comes out to about 10% of the ag land in the corn belt. And our research, particularly the Prairie Strips project in Iowa, has consistently shown that integrating 10% of cropland into perennials gives huge disproportionate positive benefits. So, you know, the number that you've come up with of 26 million acres, if it could be strategically integrated into cropland, is the same proportion that we show cleans water and holds soil and all that good stuff.
yeah, and I fear that we missed that. We missed the integrated landscape management, prairie strips, buffer strips, things like that, that can have the highest economic and environmental bang for the buck.
The report's already quite long. It's okay. Tim?
Yeah. Matt, could you just clarify the $70 per ton price? Is that farm gate price? Is that delivered to refinery? What point in the chain is that price determined at?
Farm gate per dry
Oh,
ton. Farm gate per dry short ton. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We do not just filter for marginal land. We find the areas where energy crops have comparative economic advantage and quantify that production. Yeah. Yeah, we put in a price and see how farmers respond rather than filtering for land. But
Doesn't that end up just being economically marginal land at that point then?
that's a way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, Marty, that's a great question. And maybe we can spend another webinar in the future on that. But at least for the herbaceous crops, the perennial ones, their nutrient demands are significantly lower than annual crops once established. So for Miscanthus, during the establishment phase, there's some planting costs, and we want to make sure that the crop is planted on land that has sufficient nutrients. So we often recommend fertilizing in advance of planting if needed, and we use soil test levels that are similar to what we would do for corn for PK and pH, for example. But then after that, the crop requires really just maintenance fertilizer, and the nutrient removals from these fields are rather low. So somewhere in the range of 20% or less of what would be required in a corn crop, for example. We certainly can spend more time talking about that.
See a comment about transportation cost. Damon, do you want to take a stab?
It's not factored in, right? If I'm doing that correctly. But yeah, it's transportation would be on top of what the farm gate cost would be. And we actually at INL do analysis around getting it from the farm gate to a end use, and so look at processing and transportation and that piece. And so, yeah, the further you are away from the facility, the more it costs you, I guess, is, and how you treat it after that is logistics. So. I don't know if there's anything more specific.
Some of the questions that are coming in around cost, in particular, Damon, might be conflated with inflation in the region. So $70 a ton when BT23 came out was a more reasonable price than it is now, simply because of some of the costs we've seen associated with harvesting the crop in particular. Do you have an inflation, although corn prices don't seem to have moved on average for the last 40 years, do you have an inflation value for some of the other pieces?
So that $70 was 2022 real dollars. I'm not sure about the other parts, but I am interested in that last comment there. If that's not enough to break even, then we're certainly wrong.
Yeah, so we observed like the break-even price varies from 70 on to $123 per ton. So it depends on the yield of that field. Like if yield is lower, like around less than 12 ton per hectare, then it needs around $120 or more the price to be profitable. And if yields is like around 16 ton per hectare, then it's around like $72 to be the profitable. Yeah.
So we assume marginal production in this report, which is you could look at another way. So I don't know if your land rent is included or not, but
Yeah, included.
Okay, so land rent is excluded from this, so it's kind of crop versus crop.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if land rent would maybe fix that, but just maybe to acknowledge, we don't get much when we run $60, we don't get much production at all. So it's at the point. It's at a point that's maybe the idea is it would be a tipping point where energy crop production could begin to be mobilized. And
Yeah. Considering land rent, it's around like on average $600 per hectare per year.
So Emron, I just want to clarify, you're talking about some of the most highly productive land in central Iowa, and people on this call are from a much broader region. So I would say that land rent prices that you used in a very focused analysis of a few fields is perhaps just skewed towards the upper end of the range of the data in Matt's analysis.
Yeah.
That probably does it. Yep. So in our results, we don't have miscanthus and switchgrass in the corn belt. It comes in at the margins of the corn belt. I wonder if I could bring in another slide real fast.
I just want to pause here and say, I know I promised people usually we'd finish up around 12:40 or 12:45 if you need to hop off and go about your day. I'm just going to give a quick thank you. We'll keep going here, but I want to give a shout out that next week we'll have Miley Giacometti from American Farmland Trust talking about the Midwest Biomass Coalition. Go ahead, Matt.
This might be part of our answer. This might help answer, I think, one of the other questions in the chat. So this is the mature market medium scenario result for energy crops on cropland.
So how does this factor in with your estimations on marginal land production? I'm mainly curious, there's a lot of suggestions in the text about how marginal lands, just less profitable ag land, can be used with energy crop production, but a lot of this is about cropland. So I'm curious how your analysis puts those two together to meet the biomass targets.
Yeah. So we don't call any land marginal land. We take the cropland data layer for cropland. And for each county, we have crop-specific yield and crop-specific costs. And we simulate crop competition. So we try to simulate a farmer's perspective. So, you know, why is it that farmers in the corn belt choose corn and soy and farmers in the plains choose wheat? Because wheat has comparative advantage here and corn has comparative advantage there. So we don't call anything marginal land. It's just in our result, energy crops come in here. And we're not saying this is marginal land. And there's some advice to kind of steer clear of that term, because I don't want to talk to farmers and tell them that their land's marginal, right? It's just there's different land types in different areas.
Right, but marginal land is used in the report.
So perhaps we can take this discussion offline. I just wanted to say that one thing that to consider here is the billion tons report is assessed at the county level, if I remember correctly. Is that right, Matt? And so one thing we've seen in our work is that the places where you might have a competitive economic advantage to switch to a perennial crop, those places are often masked in parts of fields. So if you scale up to a county level average in the Corn Belt, it would be rare that you would ever find a whole county that would come out as economically advantaged to switching to a perennial crop. That doesn't mean there are not places within that county where there's an economic advantage, but you wouldn't see them in this analysis.
Okay, I see.
So to sort of follow up on that, we might estimate that maybe somewhere between what, 5 and 10%, Emily, of land in our region is what we might call a prairie pothole. Stays too wet. You regularly see those crop yields very low to non-existent. But they're planted and then they die every year. Those would be ripe for this kind of conversion to a crop that's more tolerant of those flooded conditions, seasonally flooded conditions. And would those be in the future analysis estimated in these kinds of billion-ton studies?
So we showed this to Rob Mitchell. I don't know if folks here know Rob, Emily does, but who is he? ARS?
Yeah, Rob Mitchell is a grassland ecologist with the ARS in Lincoln, Nebraska, and one of the country's foremost switchgrass experts, if not the most after DK, with DK.
Yeah. And so his comment was just that, like, what the heck are you guys doing? Of course, you're going to have also areas in the Corn Belt where perennials would have comparative economic environmental advantage. And how might you quantify that? Well, maybe those areas that have, say, 25% below county average yields. So this year, we want to take another look at this. And one way to do this might be, instead of in our partial equilibrium economic model, instead of just having cropland, maybe we'd have a column for cropland and a column for marginal cropland, maybe like Heather's saying, and we call it cropland, marginal cropland, and it has a lower average yield where perennials might have comparative economic advantage in the Corn Belt too. So.
Emily, in our situation where we got corn and beans, we pay about $40, $50 less per acre on where we got the miscanthus. That was agreed upon between us and the landlord. So maybe that's your difference. You're trying to come up with marginal, but it's cheaper land. It's cheaper to rent. Better place to grow miscanthus.
Could be.
Yeah, Eric, thanks. And Matt, Eric's definitely one of the people Eric and Steve on this call. Eric Rund and Steve, if not Eric Sachs, are people you're going to want to talk to for your future work. Thanks for that, Eric. And Eric's done a nice job keeping track of some of his costs and returns associated with that land. That might be helpful to talk about in the future. Just want to make sure that we all appreciate how incredibly challenging the work that Matt shared with us today is. This is a huge computational load, even at the county level, and balancing many, well, frankly, probably political issues to conduct as an even of assessment as possible. So this is I think the baseline from which the whole community, at least in the US, if not internationally, stands upon as we think about how our costs and returns and our production values compare. It always comes back to be in comparison to what the billion-ton study reports. So I really appreciate, Matt, that you shared this with us today to give us this baseline as we go forward into a conversation. I want to note before you leave, well, in that slide, there were a few purple counties in the bottom, what we call the bottom tier of Iowa. And I see Bill Belden is got his camera on. So Bill Belden will be giving us a presentation coming up that will talk about a switchgrass project in some of those counties that, as Heather was saying, the whole county did come up as economically advantaged to switch to perhaps an energy crop product. So we'll hear about one of those projects in the future. And then we'll also hear about some of the productivity work that's being done on that corn and soybean land in future presentations. We'll also hopefully before too long get a presentation from one of the farmers in Maryland and one of these other purple areas. So we'll be featuring some of the locales that are on this map. Okay, so it's 12:50, so I'm gonna wrap us up. Let's thank Matt one more time. Thank you very much, Matt, and Damon for your contributions today. The webinar will be archived on YouTube at the link that's in the chat, but we'll share it out. And please continue to share the registration link with your friends or interested parties as we go forward. With that,